Prototype has to be one of the most painful and time-consuming games I've ever 100%ed. It's definitely the worst that I've done a video for so far, so prepare to go on a journey here with me. It's mostly a fun game, but with some absolutely infuriating moments which definitely sour the overall package, but I'll get to all those details later on. I started off missing just 7 achievements out of the 40. Everything else was unlocked in a short period of time during 2009, around the game's release time, but I only had 600 out of the 1000 gamer score, so those missing ones were worth a lot. The missing achievements were awarded for completing 3 missions without alerting the military, finding all the collectibles, completing the Web of Intrigue, which is sort of like more collectibles, finishing the game without dying, finishing the game on hard, earning gold medals in all events, and finally earning platinum medals in all events. As is seemingly becoming a theme in this series, I couldn't find a save file from back in the day, so I had to start again, but I thought, hey, at least that means I can play it on my nice new shiny Xbox. But no, it's not backwards compatible. So once more, I dusted off the Xbox 360 and got to work. For my plan of action, I decided to do 3 playthroughs, which is a bit overkill, but it's quite a short game if you're focusing on the story missions only. And I just felt this way would be better for the experience with more breathing room to get the achievements. So my first playthrough would be on normal to unlock hard mode and pretty much not have to worry about anything else, just getting back into the game. And it's worth noting here that you have to beat the game on normal to unlock hard difficulty. Easy won't do it. So had I still had my old save file, this is the run that I could have skipped, but oh well. Next, I would complete the game on Easy New Game Plus and use this playthrough to mop up all but one of my remaining achievements. So that would be finding all the collectibles, not dying during the run, not alerting the military, and getting gold and platinum medals in all events. And then after that, a final run on hard difficulty where all that mattered was completing the game. So I got started on my normal playthrough, and I'll be honest with you, I struggled a lot. I found myself sat there thinking I seriously do not remember this game being so difficult. And also very glad that I wasn't going for this run deathless, because that would have failed miserably. As it turns out, most of the difficulty came from me just not making the most of all the powers and the abilities that I had at my disposal. For example, up until the first boss, which is a specialist cross, I'd just been fighting close quarters with the claws, but against him that tactic just got me destroyed. And then I discovered the Whip Fist, which allows you to just spam from a much safer distance, and that made the game a lot easier. And to be honest, I ended up using that power pretty much the entire time. Another thing I want to quickly note is that I won't be covering the plot because truthfully, I have no idea what the plot is really. I was attempting to watch the cutscenes, but then during one early on in my first playthrough, my Xbox froze, so I got scared of watching more. So apologies if you're interested in that. Something about a virus and medical experiments and bad people, and that pretty much sums it up. Either way, I carried on through the game, and all the missions are somewhat similar. You're either fighting against the infected or against the military, sometimes even both. Sometimes you're fighting small infected, sometimes you're fighting big infected, sometimes you're in a tank, sometimes you're in a helicopter. You get the idea. Nothing was really a challenge at this point, although I was still not making the most of some powerful abilities, but I'll cover those in a bit. The second boss is the Supreme Hunter, and with my newly found Whip Fist, I pretty much made easy work of him, beating him on the first attempt by just jumping around like a wimp, dodging his attacks and whatever else he threw at me, quite literally. And a few missions after that, I actually unlocked my first achievement of the video, which I wasn't even aiming for just yet, completing 3 missions without alerting the military. I'm not entirely sure how I didn't manage to get this achievement in 2009, but I must have just gone into every mission all guns blazing. This achievement's progress actually carries over to New Game Plus, so my thinking was that I'd probably get 1 or 2 done in this run, and then the remaining in the next playthrough. But getting it out of the way this early instead was quite nice. This also marked the point the game just turned into absolute insanity for me. Again, not helped by my lack of knowledge, but the difficulty spike from this moment just felt completely ridiculous. So there are 31 story missions in total, and I think the time it took me to finish the last 4 or 5 missions was about the same it took me to complete the previous 27 or so. First up, you got to defend this pump from increasingly more difficult waves of enemies, ending with a couple of Hydras which have massive health pools, and in the end I just picked up some of the guns dropped by the military and sprayed them down. Not the most thrilling gameplay, but it got the job done after several failed attempts. And unfortunately, that meant moving on to the next mission, which has to be one of the most ridiculous bosses I've ever encountered in all of gaming. The amount of stuff going on in the Elizabeth Green fight is just not okay. I would have loved to have seen the developers playtest this and then say, yep, this is perfect. Now don't get me wrong, I was doing this without looking at any guides, and having looked it up after finishing, I've seen some better strategies, so I could have made it a lot easier for myself, but it just felt crazy. Basically, you fight this giant worm who has 3 health bars. You need to work those down before you can even damage the boss itself. She also has multiple abilities such as these green homing missiles which can just chain damage you, a barrage of rocks that she spits which also just feel like minor stun lock if you get hit, and finally, when she gets really mad, she emits a roar that would make a T-Rex proud, and anything too close to her just gets obliterated in a haze of destruction. Also add in the fact that there's a small army of hunters hounding you whilst you try to take her down, and the whole thing just becomes infuriating. One of the game's mechanics I haven't mentioned yet is the ability to consume to regenerate health. The problem is that if you take damage during the process, it cancels, or at least negates, the health buff. So running around to try safely get some health back becomes a feat in itself. Half the time you'll get slapped by a hunter, or one of her attacks will just curve wanted style around a building and interrupt you. And just to make it even more fun, sometimes the military decide that you are definitely the most pressing issue in the whole situation and will just start attacking you as well. So thanks for that, guys. Oh yeah, I haven't even brought up the fact that I was only able to take down about a third or a quarter of her health before she went underground, and then her 3 health bars replenished, meaning you've got to go through this process 3 or 4 times if, like me, you have no idea what you're doing really. And I believe that you only get a checkpoint after the first of those as well. I tried a few different approaches, first staying far away and throwing cars at her, which did some damage, but I always died before making any significant progress. Eventually I busted out the trusty whip again and got up close, jumping around, and managed to get her down for the first time and get that checkpoint. I also tried using tanks and choppers, but those just get destroyed in no time at all by the barrage of attacks you face and seemed pretty much pointless. And the next key discovery was the use of the armor form. So this removes your ability to glide but gives you more survivability, and for a strategy like this where I was just bouncing around, it worked out perfectly. There's not anything else to add to this fight right now really, other than it's terrible, and after just over 1 hour of attempts and stress I did manage to defeat her. And whilst I was relieved, I don't think I was that happy really, considering I knew I was going to have to come back later on hard. And if I could give you one word to describe that experience, I would say awful is a pretty appropriate one, but we'll get to that later. The next mission was also a struggle, mainly of my own doing for trying to just brute force it and run and gun style, but the game punished me hard. So I had to play a lot smarter than that and grab a tank without causing alert to fight through the highly guarded area and destroy these filters, but I got there eventually. The last 2 standard missions were a bit long but not very difficult, just destroying a load of helicopters and then tanks, which led me to the final boss. Now this boss is just another form of the Supreme Hunter, but this time he has access to the Devastator abilities. Devastators are the most powerful abilities in the game, and up until this point, yes, the very last mission, I hadn't been using them because I'd forgotten how and I couldn't be bothered to look it up. So if your health bar reaches a high enough point, you enter a critical mass stage where it starts to flash blue, and that means you're able to cast these abilities. There's a few different ones, but the coolest is definitely the Tendril Barrage, which the Supreme Hunter uses. Its attacks become quite easy to read after a small amount of practice, and also have some audio cues, so if you're paying attention it's a relatively easy fight, on normal difficulty anyway. And also I'm not entirely sure how it works, but it's possible to stun the hunter and get this quick time event to deal some rapid damage. I think maybe it's if you deal enough damage in a short period of time, but that might be wrong. There was also a lot of military running around the area, so they're perfect to consume and get your health up to use the Devastators regularly. So I had 1 death on this, and on the second attempt I got it done, completing normal difficulty and unlocking both New Game Plus and the hard difficulty. I didn't mention this earlier, but it's not possible to New Game Plus on hard difficulty for your first time anyway. You can only New Game Plus on equal or lower difficulty to that which you just completed the game on. So no carrying over powers and whatever else sadly, so my hard run had to be from scratch. But that wasn't next on my list of things to do, so I'll cover that in a bit. Also, it's funny looking at my stats after this run. First of all, it took 6 hours, and I think after about 3 of those hours, I just had a few missions left. But also a nice casual 39 deaths. I'm glad I didn't go into my first playthrough planning on not dying, let's just say that. But with normal difficulty ticked off, I took a bit of a break, but then later that same day went back into another run, this time on Easy New Game Plus. So the goal here was to not die, and other than a couple of slightly nervy moments, it was a breeze overall. I actually ended up doing the entire thing in one sitting of around 4.5 hours. It's amazing what a difference actually knowing how to use all my abilities made, eh? Well, that plus being on an easier difficulty with all my unlocks carried over and having just practiced everything earlier that day also. Rooms like this, which I struggled through on my first run, you know, taking out the enemies one by one, I could just absolutely obliterate with one Devastator. The fight at the pump was a dreamy walk in the park compared to the way I limped through it on normal. And even the abomination that is Elizabeth Green took me a mere 10 minutes this time around. Although there was a point I got caught up in her attack chain and did briefly see my life flash before my eyes. It's also worth noting that for the No Deaths achievement, you can fail missions by having important vehicles get destroyed, etc. You just can't die. That sounds obvious when I say it, but someone out there might be unsure. After that, I was quickly onto the Supreme Hunter again and, employing the same tactics as before, brushed him aside. Then once I had loaded back into the game to this edgy superhero inspired cinematic, my achievement popped. A nice 60 gamer score for my troubles, but my work was far from done here. Next I had some serious mopping up to do of miscellaneous tasks, starting with the collectibles, and at this point I was at just over 10 hours played for those 2 achievements, and the next 5 certainly didn't get any quicker. There are effectively 3 forms of collectibles: 200 blue orbs, 50 purple orbs, and 131 NPCs to consume for the Web of Intrigue, which is basically just important people whose memories you want to recover. I started off with the orbs and found a good video to follow along. It was a painfully slow process though, checking I matched the position on my map as shown in the video, then finding the collectible when half the buildings looked the same. And in total, this process took me nearly 5 hours. Yes, that's right, I think my entire run through the story on easy was quicker than getting all these. And I split it into a few sessions because this was just so mind-numbingly boring, even I couldn't do it without a break. It also didn't help when I got stuck on the same collectible for about 15 minutes just trying to get the jump and glide right to reach it. And then the absolute cherry on the cake for the whole thing had to be when I noticed that the guy in the video got the last purple orb and he had an achievement pop, but I didn't. So I had a look and it turns out I'd already collected all 50 of those back in 2009. So I could have saved myself some time by just using a video that only did the blue ones. But no time to cry about that because just a minute or so later I grabbed the last blue collectible and unlocked another achievement. With that done, I just had one collectible related achievement left, so now would be a good idea to go into a bit more detail about how that works, I think. The web targets show up on your minimap as these red head icons when you are close and can roam around, but each target is kind of soft locked to a part of the map and won't really wander beyond that. It's also possible for them to die, which can be frustrating if you run up to one only to see them get blown up by a tank or slapped by an infected right in your face. But if you come back 10 minutes or so later, they will have respawned again. So rather than hunt all of these down now, I decided that I should get the events completed first because those would have me running all over the map anyway, and I could just grab whichever web targets I see along the way and then clear up the rest afterwards. So going back to the events, they're broken up into 4 categories: gliding, movement, kill, and war. I was missing the achievements for getting gold and plat medals in all, but to even unlock platinum and see it as a reward, I first had to get gold in all 53 of the events. It's worth noting that if you meet the requirement for the platinum medal but haven't unlocked it yet, your medal will automatically upgrade when you do finish all golds. So I found all the gold/plat requirements that someone had typed up and copy and pasted that into a text document so I could just go for the plat medal on events I found quite easy or didn't mind grinding for a bit, and then just deleting them as I went along. The last thing worth mentioning about the medal requirements is there is a pretty brutal glitch where if you get platinum scores in all events before getting the gold achievement, then you lock yourself out of getting the plat one. So you need to leave at least one at just gold until you've got the gold achievement, and then when you upgrade that to plat, your achievement will pop. Hopefully that makes sense. I started off with the glide events because they're generally considered the easiest. You simply need to glide from a start point and then land as close to the center of the target as possible. So in order to make these easier, you want to have all your movement upgrades. I won't bother showing you all of them because that would just take far too long, and most were pretty straightforward. There were a couple of trickier ones, such as having to land on this railway bridge, which took me a few tries. And also this pretty unique one where you land in the water, which basically resets your glide and then you have to readjust to the target. But I got there eventually, and the last event I did in style, nailing it first try. There was also plenty of near misses, but you'll see that's a common theme through all the events. And in total it took me just slightly over 1 hour to get the plat requirement on all glide events. After those, I started mixing it up by tackling both war and the kill challenges. I didn't have an order or anything, I just went to whatever I felt like doing or was close to me and gave it a go. Also, whilst doing all of this, I was paying attention to the minimap and just grabbing any web targets when they appeared. The kill events require you to wipe out as many targets as possible, either infected or military, in a relatively short amount of time, and usually lock you to a specific weapon, power or vehicle, whilst the war events have you fighting for either side against the other and give you a set amount of enemies to wipe out as quickly as possible. And I should also mention here that I believe the difficulty setting does affect events as well, so that's why I decided to go for all of them whilst I was on my easy save file. So some I managed to get gold in super quickly, even first time occasionally, but others I was just miles off. But rather than just grind the same one over and over, I hopped around trying out different events. The vehicle ones I struggled with more than the others, but I didn't always have the right approach, as I'll show you in a bit. Also, some of the events where you have to use a certain power, I could see watching back that I didn't always make the most of my attacks, which would have made life much easier. Either way, after just over 4 hours of working on these, I managed to achieve gold in all the war events. Some I actually managed to get the plat requirement, but a lot were just gold. Also, I was quite close to having gold in all kills, but wasn't able to get there on a few, and at this point was feeling pretty burnt out after all that killing, so decided to move on and then come back to finish them later. That meant starting the movement events, and to tell you the truth, I actually found these to be a pretty fun challenge, despite reading online that they'd be the worst to do. I just felt that in some of the other events, RNG plays such a big factor in your medal, like when the enemies can spawn in different locations and their pathing can change, etc. Whereas with movement, everything seemed doable, it was just up to me to nail it. Don't get me wrong, there were some tricky ones that required some grinding and lots of painful near misses, but I managed to get gold in all of them in just over 1 hour. And like all the others, I did my best to not look up any guides or routes and just figure it out myself. I actually think one of the only times I looked up anything for the movement events was on one of the first I attempted, because I was just absolutely miles off the time, but within seconds I'd seen a way to combo my glide and dash that I hadn't been doing, and that was something that I was pretty much able just to repeat through all the events really. And with golds in all movements done, it meant I only had a couple of kill events left to finish off, but first there was something else I decided to tackle which would help. I've mentioned upgrades a few times, and these are slowly unlocked as you progress through the story missions. The game doesn't really tell you much about them, so it's best just to check regularly and see what's new. Then you purchase them with evolution points, which you get for general gameplay. There are, however, some upgrades which you need to do something a bit different for. Those are for vehicles and weaponry, and instead require you to consume relevant members of the military. There are several military bases scattered around the map, and each has not only these people in them, but also Web of Intrigue targets. So I thought it would be logical to go get all those now, and the upgrades would obviously help with the events. It is a bit of a faff getting all of these done, because to get into the military base I first had to locate and then stealth consume the commander outside. Then once inside there were 3 targets. I'm not sure what the quickest approach is, but I would use stealth for the first 2 and then just consume the 3rd in front of everyone before killing everyone else in the base, which then allowed me to exit. And there are around 6 bases in the game, so going through all of them like this took me around 1 hour. But once I'd acquired all the upgrades, I got back to the events and noticed a big difference instantly. Previously on the vehicle challenges I was really struggling. Like this tank one for instance, I wasn't even getting a score because the tank kept getting destroyed. but with the upgrades it's able to take a lot more damage. After another hour or so of grinding, I was down to my last event for gold, and that was a helicopter one. I did actually look up a video for one of the helicopter events because I was just getting nowhere near to the required score, but then I saw that rather than focusing on the marked targets, it's actually much easier to rack up a big score by simply flying low and just bombarding the ground with the standard missiles. And that's a strategy which can be used in most of the chopper events also. So putting that method into action, I quickly got the score needed for gold, and with that got the achievement for gold medals in all 53 events. This also meant that I'd now unlocked platinum medals. The events which I'd already met the required score in automatically upgraded, and I'm not sure on the exact number, but I had just under 15 events left to get platin. Unfortunately, the grind still wasn't close to being done here because, checking all my recordings, these last events still took me around 5 hours of game time. Like I previously mentioned, I had platinum in all the glides already, so the next category I decided to tick off was the kill events. The one that took me the longest probably was Knuckle Dragger, which locks you to using only your hammer fist power. It was a bit of a pain to be honest, and felt super dependent on RNG. Whilst there are mostly military foot soldiers running around, the big scores come from destroying tanks. In order to get the platinum medal, you basically need to be destroying tanks non-stop, but unfortunately they just don't always spawn quick enough, or they'll despawn if you accidentally go too far away from them. So after many attempts of just hoping I got lucky with the spawns really, I eventually did and got the score needed. And after that I just had one kill event left. Again, you need to wipe out as many military as possible, but this time in a helicopter, and the best way of doing this I found was just to fly up really high, and these drones just constantly fly at you in swarms and can pretty much be one hit with your machine gun. The odd chopper will appear, which is a nice boost to your points. But yeah, I got this one done first try, post upgrades, and with that finished plat medals in all kill events. Moving on to the wars, I had 3 remaining at this point, and after about 20 minutes that was down to 1. There was an interesting event which I just couldn't do fast enough, but then realised instead of destroying all the tanks, I could just hijack one instead and use it to speed up the destruction. The other was super simple. Then the last war event I had to do was Raid. And now, I haven't talked about Raid yet, but if you look this achievement up, this seems to be the event which stands in the way for most people. I could tell just from going for the gold medal that this was a lot harder than pretty much all the others because I was barely scraping gold, and the plat required you to be 20 seconds faster on top of that. I attempted it for about 20 minutes, then decided I'd move on to something else. So I'll be returning to this one shortly. With everything else done, I had no choice but to get back to the movement events, of which I had 5 remaining. I said before, and I'll say it again, I really like these ones. There's no RNG involved. It's just all on you to nail your pathing and your jump, dash and glide combos. Basically, just get good and the plat will be yours. This first one took me about 20 minutes of trying, and there were some heart-sinking near misses, but we got there eventually. And then I more than made up for it by scraping the next event first try, getting under the plat time by 0.4 of a second. There were so many moments over all the event grinding that I was 1 score off or less than half a second or something, but this video would just never end if I showed you all of that, so just know that I suffered a lot behind the scenes. And speaking of suffering, this movement event called Corners was one of the longest in both time it actually takes to run, but also how long I spent grinding it. Eventually though, after a 45-minute session, I nailed the dashing and gliding across rooftops and claimed the plat in under 1:45. The final challenge was pretty much the complete opposite end of the spectrum because the plat time is 18 seconds. I was unstoppable in the parkour groove now though, and after just a few minutes of attempts, unlocked the last movement platinum medal, and now just 1 remained across all disciplines. The dreaded Raid. I'll cut to the chase. It was terrible. I got it done, but it was terrible. Looking back at my recordings, it only took me 1 hour, which is obviously by no means the worst grind I've ever done, but other than a few tweaks I made to my approach, I was basically just doing the same thing over and over again and hoping that RNG would be on my side eventually. I had to fight a few waves of hunters and other common infected using only a grenade launcher. I did have a friendly tank attempting to assist me, but honestly it just seems to be pot luck whereabouts that spawns and how useful it feels like being. The hunters did destroy it extremely quickly, and I needed it if I was going to have any chance of getting the plat medal, so my focus was always on the hunters. Unfortunately, it's not that easy though, because the waves of infected like to run straight into my face and take the grenades point blank instead, and that would cause me to knock myself back and waste precious seconds. So in the end, my strategy was to stay close to their spawn and try grab all the attention and keep the tank as safe as possible, whilst wiping out the hunters as quick as I could and jumping away from the common infected when they got too close. Other than that, it really was just hoping that they clustered in ways which meant my grenades would splash damage, but also the tank could massively help. So yeah, I just tried and tried and tried, and I think the closest I'd got was 4 seconds or so over the 125 I needed. But then I had a run where I could tell it was now or never. I managed, by sheer luck really, to get the hunters somewhat stunned by my grenades in the group here, and the tank was right next to me and did some serious work. And then the next wave, pretty much the same thing happened, and finally, to my absolutely massive relief, I got the time I needed, meaning I'd reached the end of my event grinding, and more importantly, unlocked the beautiful Platinum Medal achievement. Looking at all the footage I had, these events alone took me around 14 hours to complete, and well, I probably don't need to say any more about that, really, do I? After that was finally done, I now just had 2 achievements left, one of which I'd been slowly chipping away at on the side, completing the Web of Intrigue. At this point, I had around 100 of the 131 targets and used a pretty handy map that I found on True Achievements to help me clear up the rest. The map showed the rough location that each target was bound to, and I just referenced that after looking at the in-game web interface to see who I was missing. It took me around half an hour or so to find all of those, and by consuming the last one, I got my next achievement. Now that meant the end of my Easy New Game Plus playthrough, and in total I spent a pretty hefty 26 hours on it, but managed to get my Deathless run as well as all the events, collectibles and web achievements, so time well spent. Maybe. Now I just had 1 achievement left, finishing the game on hard difficulty, and it was nice going into this knowing that all that mattered was reaching the end credits. I could die as many times I wanted, consume and collect what I did or didn't want, and I would like to think that I knew what I was doing by this point because I'd obviously had a lot of practice. Starting up on hard, I wasn't sure if I would slightly regret how I planned out my achievements, because my thinking was that maybe it would have been better to do the collectibles on this run because you get evolution points for them, and therefore I would have been able to upgrade my powers quicker, helping with the high difficulty. But in the end I managed it just fine, and I don't think that would have been necessary really. I did still grab collectibles whenever I came across them though, just for a nice little bonus. Some of the early encounters were a bit tricky, but ended up being a test of patience more than anything else really. Like the first time you fight hunters, you need to fight through several waves of them in this room, but you don't have many powers to choose from and your health pool is really small at this point. So I ended up just using the military weapons that would slowly spawn in, as well as consuming the soldiers for health when I needed it, and otherwise just running around in circles. And in the end I used guns for quite a lot of the early missions, until I had the trusty whip fist at least. For the first boss encounter, Specialist Cross, I used the same tactic as previous runs, but this time had to pay a bit more attention. I'm not sure if this mechanic is only something you have to deal with on hard, or maybe I just didn't notice on other difficulties because it did much smaller damage. But basically if you attack him whilst he's wielding his electric baton thing, you'll be damaged quite significantly. So I just had to choose my moments to attack him more carefully, but got it done pretty easily regardless. There was a bit of an annoying escort mission to do shortly after that, in which I had to keep a tank alive and help guide it to several hives. The problem is that the hunters killed it really quickly, and it would also be damaged by my own attacks, so if I tried to use my Tendril Devastator or anything else AoE whilst too close to it, it would just become a near instant fail. But after a few fails I got there and moved on to the next boss. And that was the Supreme Hunter, which was also no match for my immense tactic of jumping around and spamming Whip Fist. It took me about 10 minutes to whittle it down, and I beat him first try. But sadly that meant I was rapidly approaching the dreaded last part of the game. After another 45 minutes or so of simple missions, I was back at the pump defense for the final time. I had to restart a couple of times due to either dying or the pump being destroyed, but I did make it through. This last wave with the 2 Hydras was a bit ridiculous though. I must have been missing something because I don't think my strategy of spraying them down with machine guns for 5 minutes is what the developers had in mind. But next up was the super fun Elizabeth Green fight, and everything I said earlier can just be copy and pasted here. I still found it just as frustrating as before. The good news is that I did it on my first try. The bad news is that that one try still took me 45 minutes. Since completing the game, I have had a read online and it seems the best tactic is to use your blade power to do a strong falling attack from the nearby buildings. I have no idea how much quicker that is compared to what I did, but from a quick browse it does seem to be agreed that that is the best strategy. So for anyone who for some reason is inspired to give this a go after watching this video, do it that way instead. And thinking about it, that might be the best method to take out the Hydras just before this also. Moving on though, with the Elizabeth Green boss fight out of the way, I was on the home stretch now. And this mission where you need to destroy groups of tanks took a while because my approach was to steal RPGs and just shoot them down from a safe distance. You can't really run up to them on hard without just getting blasted into pieces, so I had to be patient, but I got it done. And then I was on to the last boss fight. Taking down the Supreme Hunter again was a little tricky as well. I did fail a couple of times, not because I died, but because I just ran out of time. I didn't mention it before because you don't even really notice it being there on lower difficulties, but the final phase has a time limit, so I had to be somewhat prepared on hard, like in my critical mass going into the timed part, so I was able to use a couple of Devastators. Also, this part of the fight has no military running around, so there was no one to consume and build up my bar. Other than that, I was just enjoying my final time jumping around and spamming Whip Fist, to be honest. And on my 3rd attempt, I think it was, I beat the final boss with a little under 30 seconds remaining. And out of this lovely particle fountain popped my achievement. In the end, my hard playthrough took me just under 7 hours, which puts me somewhere between 30 and 40 hours for this whole thing. Was it worth it? Of course it was. How could anyone think otherwise when they see that beautiful 1000 out of 1000 gamer score? But anyway, that's me done with Prototype. Another game I've been telling myself for years to finish, finally finished. Certainly glad it's done, and I wish anyone who decides to do the same good luck. If there's any other games in particular you would like to see a video about in this style, then please let me know and I can add it to my list. But that's me done for this video, so thanks for sticking with me because it's been a long one, and I'll see you in the next one.